May peace and blessings be upon you all. Good morning to all ladies and gentlemen in the Eastern time zone, and good evening to our learned guest speaker, Mr. Mustafa Aikol, who is joining us all the way from the United States. Welcome to G25 Malaysia and EdUnity Foundation's webinar on freedom and tolerance in Islam, why we need some rethinking. My name is Shad Salim Faruqi, and it's my privilege to be the moderator for today's webinar. Our topic is indeed very important because freedom is a natural human need, and its flowering and flourishing within some broad limits is the mark of all great civilizations. Civilizations rise and fall depending on the extent to which there is freedom to think, reason, read, write, speculate on the challenges and opportunities of life. However, freedom should not be regarded as synonymous with moral anarchy. As a German scholar once said, freedom per se has no value. It's what freedom is for. It's the use to which it is put. It's the sense of restraint and responsibility with which it is exercised. Today we are meeting to discuss how far freedom and tolerance are part of Islam and how we need to rethink on this issue. Let me first welcome the learned guest speaker, Mr. Mustafa Aikol, and the two distinguished commentators, Rozana Muhammad Isa and Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. Our learned guest speaker, Mr. Mustafa Aikol, is an author and journalist, as well as a senior fellow for the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, which is based in Washington, D.C. Now, after Mr. Mustafa has given his presentation, we'll be hearing from our two commentators who are Malaysia's very own scholars. The first is Rozana Muhammad Isa, a women's rights activist and the executive director of Sisters in Islam, a Malaysian non-governmental organization working on women's rights within the framework of Islam. And the second will be Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, an internationally renowned author and social activist, author of about 30 books, I believe. He's the president of the International Movement for a Just World, an international NGO based in Malaysia, which seeks to critique global injustice and to develop an alternative vision and view of a just and compassionate civilization guided by universal spiritual and moral values. Now, after we hear from our guest speaker and the two commentators, we will move on to a question and answer session using Slido, where you can ask the panelists any questions you have from your own home. All you have to do is to open your internet browser, go to slido.com, enter the event code #G25 and submit your questions. Well, without further ado, let's begin our webinar. Mr. Mustafa, the floor is yours for the next 30 minutes. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much, dear Dr. Faruqi. And I'm very thankful to our organizers, to G25, for bringing me to Malaysia again through this event. Sisters in Islam and our colleagues and whoever taken part in this organization. Thank you for bringing these issues, which not just Malaysia, but we need to discuss all across the Ummah, all across the Muslim world. And I want to greet everybody who's listening to us, either in Malaysia or where they can be in different parts of the world. Now, Malaysia is a precious country for me. It's an important country for me. I visited Malaysia, I think, 5 times in 10 years, between 2009 and 2017, 8 years actually. I was invited by various organizations, most of the time into IRF, the International Islamic Renaissance Front. which also published my earlier book, Islam Without Extremes in Malay. And I was in Malaysia to give lectures, to be on panels, and every time I enjoyed it. But you may be aware that the last visit I had to Malaysia, or let's say the latest visit, maybe inshallah it won't be the last, we don't know the future, but the latest visit I had was a little bit eventful. It was 2017, September, and I flew to Malaysia again from the United States, from Boston, actually, at the time. And I came because the I keep saying it, Islamic Renaissance Front had organized 4 different lectures for me, public lectures for me, on my book and related topics. And the second event was titled, Does Freedom of Conscience Open the Floodgates of Apostasy? And in a Kuala Lumpur venue, I spoke to a large audience, mostly Malay Muslims, but I think some non-Muslims, especially Christians as well. And I said, which is what I'm going to repeat today. I'm not an imam, I'm not a mufti, I'm not a sheikh. I can't religiously guide anybody. So I'm not, maybe I don't need tawliya from the authorities in that sense. I'm not religiously the guide of anybody. I'm just an ordinary Muslim. But I'm an ordinary Muslim who's concerned about the problems of the ummah since my high school years. And one thing I've come to realize is that we have a freedom deficit, as I call it, in our religious understanding today. And I've been academically studying the meaning of freedom in Islam and some of the problems and how we can solve those problems within the framework of Islam. So I'm sharing perspectives from an academic and journalistic perspective. It's just an intellectual idea, and it's up to the scholars to make the fatwa. So I'm not going to try to replace them. But we have also seen in the past 150 years in the Islamic world that sometimes we need to push the scholars through social activism, through journalism, through intellectual narratives, so that those narratives influence society and sometimes ultimately the scholars. And there has been many people who have done that since the late Ottoman Empire and so on and so forth. And in India subcontinent as well. And I'm trying to revitalize that tradition. Now, what happened in my visit in Malaysia in 2017? I came to this event and I lectured, and it was welcome. For 30 minutes, I said apostasy, or ridda, as we call it in Arabic, in the Islamic tradition, was considered in medieval Islamic jurisprudence as a crime punishable by death, like a capital crime. But I said, this can be revisited and abolished today. Because I said, this idea that apostates should be punished has no basis in the Quran. It comes from secondary sources, which I will get into that a bit, which are open to discussion. And third, it appeared in a particular context in which apostasy was leaving your religious group and joining the other group, which was potentially the enemy that you're fighting with. So it had a very strong connotation of treason, political treason, and even military treason. But today, we live in a very different world. People, when they change their religion, they don't become an enemy of a certain group. They don't become violent, hostile people. It's their faith, which is only with God. And also, it is very clear that if somebody loses faith in Islam, you can't make that person believe in Islam again by threatening that person. You can't make him a mu'min, a believer. You can make him a munafiq, which is a hypocrite. So what do we achieve by that? So I made these points and I said, let's take the Quranic verse, a very important part of a verse, Baqarah 256, which has become a motto in the modern era, seriously. And that verse reads, La ikraha fid din, which means there is no compulsion in religion, or let there be no compulsion in religion. Now, this was the talk that I gave in Malaysia 4 years ago, which is probably, I think, online still. At the end of the event, I was approached by some serious gentlemen, and I learned that they are from Javi, the religion police, and they showed me their identity cards. And it defined their job as religion enforcement officer. So they asked me a few questions, gave me a document that I didn't understand, and the next day I was summoned to their headquarters. I didn't know what to do. I had a flight at night, so I wanted to catch that flight. And I was stopped at the airport and I was arrested. And I was told that night that I violated the law, which bans teaching Islam without tawliya, which is permission from the authorities. And I would be probably go to jail for 2 years. So I came to Malaysia for conference, but had this very unexpected moment. Of course, this was a difficult night, but luckily, with some diplomacy, I was released the next day. And I should say that nobody was harsh to me. People go through really terrible experiences sometimes when they get arrested on crimes like this in other countries, like Iran or Saudi Arabia. So Malay authorities were gentle. I appreciate that. But the point is, one thing that really was amazing to me during the interrogation that I had in the Sharia court was that both the religion police and the judge there a few times asked me, did you in your speech quote La ikraha fid din, no compulsion in religion? And I said, yes, I did. And I didn't understand why were they somehow uncomfortable with me, a Muslim, quoting a verse from the Quran on a very important matter. Then I thought, after I was released, actually, I was at the airport, Kuala Lumpur International Airport, waiting for my flight. And I was saying, why are they unhappy with me? Why were they unhappy with me quoting La ikraha fid din, no compulsion in religion? Then I said, let me see how they write it. Then I went into the website of JAKIM, the official religious institution in Malaysia, the religious ministry. And there I saw what I suspected, which is the translation of La ikraha fid din, no compulsion in religion, is given with some editing. Now I will show you, if you allow me 1 second, how that happens. Okay, so is my screen visible now? Okay, is my screen visible? Good. So this is the Quranic verse that I'm quoting. There shall be no compulsion in religion. Probably every Muslim is familiar with this statement. But JAKIM writes it a little bit a different way. I mean, they used to. I don't know if they changed in the past few years, but I checked a few times. It was the same thing. There it writes, let me see. Still learning how to do this. There shall be no compulsion in religion in becoming a Muslim. As you see, there's a little parenthesis inserted there. So that statement, in becoming a Muslim, is not in the verse, but it is inserted into the translation. And what difference does it make? Well, it makes a very important difference, because when you hear the statement, the ayah, there shall be no compulsion in religion, the impression you get is that religion should be based on no compulsion. In other words, freedom. That you can think that. So that means somebody can freely become a Muslim, and a Muslim maybe freely, join another religion, maybe become a Christian if he loses his faith. We as Muslims don't want to see that, but that can happen. As sometimes Christians, convert to Islam. It happens. Also, there is no compulsion in religion means while you are a Muslim, your practices should be without any compulsion. Because it's between you and God. Like, you fast in Ramadan, that's a wonderful act of worship. But if you don't fast one day for some reason and eat a glass of water on the street, there shall be no compulsion on you, because this is religion, and religion is based on no compulsion. It's based on freedom. So you can understand the verse like that. But precisely because of that, the interpreters, the translators of JAKIM, wanted to prevent any such interpretation. So they inserted this clause: there shall be no compulsion in religion, only in becoming a Muslim. Of course, Jakim is not the only authority that does this. I've seen other translations of the Quran in the modern era, including Sahih International, a famous Quranic translation printed in Saudi Arabia. And there you see a very similar editing. There shall be no compulsion in religion in acceptance of the religion. Again, the no compulsion clause is severely limited to only accepting Islam. Once you accept Islam, once you're in it, there is a lot of compulsion. You can't leave, and also you're subject to the authority of religious police called Hisbah. In Saudi Arabia, of course, this is in a more severe level, but we have examples of that in Malaysia as well. In the Aceh province of Indonesia, we have also religious police forces. And in about a dozen Muslim almost countries, you have this compulsive authorities that either punish apostasy or control whether Muslims are really pious. In Iran, this leads to religious policing on women's dress code, so women are forced to cover their head and wear a hijab, which is, again, not a very no compulsion in religion type of approach. Now, why does the Quran say this, but we have these editings on the Quran? So, because of course the Quran is not the I'm still online, right? I hope I didn't make a mistake. Okay. Because the Quran is not, of course, the only source of Islam. There are post-Quranic sources. First, there are hadiths, sayings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And of course, they're important, and they're very important for us to understand the context of the Quran. A lot of concepts in the Quran are just mentioned briefly from the hadiths, and also the seerah, the biography of the Prophet. We learn more. And I don't agree with some fellow Muslims who call themselves Quranists, in the sense that they say we only look at the Quran, we don't care about anything else. And I don't think that's a sound approach, because the Quran came to a context and we need to know more about it from the other sources about it. However, this is different than saying that we have to blindly accept whatever was decided by medieval muhaddithun, the hadith scholars, once they collected everything as the authentic ones. Everybody in Islam knows that there were many fake hadiths, there were many forgeries, there were many manipulations in the first 2 centuries after the Prophet Muhammad, because hadiths were not directly written down during his lifetime. Actually, we have a hadith telling that he banned writing down the hadiths. The explanation is given that he banned the hadiths so that they shouldn't be confused with the Quran, they shouldn't be mixed with the Quran. Or maybe he didn't see them as necessary, so it could be interpreted in both ways. But ultimately, hadith collections in Kutub Sitta, the 6 books, especially the 2 books, Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, have become authoritative. And the ban on apostasy, which I'm speaking about, comes from the hadiths. There's a hadith which reads, whomever leaves his religion, kill him, in Sahih Bukhari. And that is why the religion police in Malaysia or other conservative authorities look at the Quran, they see la ikraha fi din, no compulsion in religion, but then there's the other hadith, whomever leaves his religion, kill him. So they they take the hadith as authoritative as well, as authoritative as the Quran, which I think is a disputable approach. And so therefore, by looking at that, they limit the Quranic freedom offered by Baqarah 256. Of course, I mean, whether the Prophet Muhammad really said that is a question we can discuss. We don't, I think, have the obligation to consider everything in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim as really Sahih. In particular, this hadith about apostasy is not a mutawatir hadith, which means it is coming from many sources, which makes it very hard which makes it very hard for it to be a forgery. It's ahad hadith, which means it's coming from one single narrator. And that narrator was disputed by some people in the Islamic tradition. So it is a suspicious hadith, in my view. And I made that case, and I explained why we can look at it this way in the in my book. There's a whole chapter about this apostasy issue and the hadith. Now, what is even more interesting is this. The ban on apostasy, that apostates leave, those who leave Islam should be executed. When did this appear? This appeared at a time. I'm assuming that it didn't directly come from the Prophet, but when Muslims became an empire, it appeared at a time when Muslims became an imperial power. Because after the Prophet, Muslims established a empire, first under the 4 caliphs, and then the Umayyads, and then the Abbasids, that stretched from Spain to India. What was the culture of that era? Well, when you look into the culture of the era, when you look at the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire, they also had laws which gave death penalty to apostates. Because at that time, in that medieval world, your allegiance to the state, the ruler, was very much connected with your faith. And when you left the faith, you would immediately become the enemy of the state. So it is in the Sassanid laws. It is in the Byzantine laws. Similarly, blasphemy laws. Offending the gods, as Sassanids put it, because Sassanids were polytheists, was a crime punishable by death. So my understanding is that although the Quran said there's no compulsion in religion, Muslims established an empire and they adopted norms of the time. And we should understand bans on apostasy and blasphemy, which is leading to a lot of human rights violations in the Muslim world today, as a product of that context. I would say the same thing for religious policing. Hispa, as it's called. I have a chapter on that in my new book as well, Freedom Matters, Hispa. And there I argue that the whole idea of muhtasib, the one that does hispa, which we understand, and a lot of people today understand as religious policing. When we look at its origins, when we look at what Prophet Muhammad did, we see that Prophet Muhammad indeed established a police force in Medina who called the muhtasib, later called the muhtasib, whose job was not punishing people if they didn't pray, but whose job was preventing fraud in the Medina market. Actually, there's a story about it. One day, Prophet Muhammad, who himself was a merchant, so he knew the market dynamics. He came one day to the market and he saw a man who was selling grain and putting water on top of it. So he was making it heavy, so he was doing fraud. So he established a police force to prevent fraud. And in the early centuries of Islam, these people were called Sahib al-Suk, which means the owner of the market, which means actually or the overseer of the market. And they were really, their job, when you look at the manuals about it, is about to prevent fraud, to check the scales are fair, or if there is any threat, like check the waterways, like normal security issues that would have in every society. Over time, it turned into beating who doesn't pray. Over time, it turned into flogging those who play music, which was considered as a crime by some people at the time, as haram at the time. Now, my contention and understanding is that Islam was born in 7th century Arabia with divine revelation, and the Quran is the core of it. And then it unfolded in human history. And that human history had a lot of institutions and norms. And those institutions and norms were adopted by Muslims of the time, who were jurists, who were pious scholars. We are not disrespecting them, but they lived at a time which was different than us, and they adopted certain things. Those, not every injunction, not every commandment they adopted, not every interpretation they made is eternally valid. And there is actually a very good case that we can see this. Today, let's talk about reform in Islamic law, in the Sharia, or jurisprudence, interpretation of the Sharia. Many Muslims, when they hear the word reform, they will be uncomfortable and they will say, this is some effort to change our religion, some hideous Western effort behind that, and so on and so forth. I'll ask those Muslims, what do you think about slavery? Many Muslims, when they hear the word slavery, they will say, oh, slavery is against Islam, or Islam is against slavery. Good, very good. Happy to hear that. But then let's ask, but did you read jurisprudence, fiqh, about slavery? Until the 19th century, every major jurisprudential school in Islam accepted slavery as a fact of life. It legislated slavery. How you enslave people after a battle. Some rights for slaves. So Islam actually improved the rights of slaves. That's a fact, important fact. But they were still slaves. Until the 19th century, until late 19th century, there were slave markets in Istanbul, my hometown, or Cairo. Ultimately, it was abolished. Partly thanks to Western efforts for abolition, came from Britain a lot. Partly thanks to Muslim liberals, people whose ideas I follow, who said abolition of slavery is a maybe idea coming from the West, but they saw the inspiration also in the Quran, because the Quran praised freeing the slaves. Freeing a neck, as the Quran called it, was a moral act. But Muslims didn't think about that until the modern era, when the idea came from Western human rights discourse, actually, abolition discourse. This doesn't mean everything the West did in the past 2 centuries, especially in the world of Islam, is right, but there has been some good ideas that actually helped us, including abolition of slavery. So should we have preserved slavery, thinking this is an integral part of the Sharia? Some people said that. When the Ottoman Empire banned slave trade, it was the first step in 1956. There was a revolt against the Ottoman Empire in Mecca by Sharif Abdul Muttalib, and he said the Turks have become kafirs. Why they're kafir? They banned slave trade. He said it's in the Sharia. Well, it was in the Sharia because when classical scholars were looking in the world, they were living in a world that slavery was a normal. The Quran spoke of slaves and called for freeing them, but also legislated the institution because in that society it existed. So on this issue, a lot of Muslims today agree that ultimately Islam's long-term goal was to abolish slavery. And I like that argument. I support that argument. But if we are accepting that we could interpret the Sharia on slavery, why can't we interpret it on women's rights? Why can't we interpret it on equality before law? And because you can find Islamic sources for them, but they were not 100% fulfilled in the classical era. On women's rights, for example, one of the most important issues in the Muslim world today, when you look in the Quran, when you look at Quranic injunctions, you generally see that the Quranic intention is to uplift the woman, give them rights that they didn't have before. There are stories of in Asbab al-Nuzul or in hadith books, stories of women coming to Prophet Muhammad's wife, Aisha, and complaining about some injustice they had from their husbands. And then Prophet Muhammad, or sometimes the worst, comes and protects the woman against the injustice of the husband. So, but Islam uplifted women according to the norms of 7th century society. For example, Islam gave women the inheritance rights but not as equal to men, but it gave half of the rights of the male heir. Like if a father dies, he has a son and he has a daughter, the son gets twice of the share of the inheritance. Now, is this a template that we have to keep forever? Or should we look into the conditions of 7th century Arabia? In that society, no woman was responsible for taking care of a household. Women were always taken care of by men. So giving a man twice the share of a female was quite actually generous for the female. It was a guarantee for her. But we live in a different socioeconomic condition right now. There's so many women who are to take caretakers of their homes. They're single mothers. They're women who are not married. Why would they get less than men? Is this conscientiously acceptable? Well, if you understand everything literally, you would say we can't make any change. But if you understand the intentions of God, if you understand the maqasid, and if you focus on that, the intentions of the Sharia, you can make that switch. Now, you can say women should get equal rights right now because the goal of Islam was justice, and justice is today served by equal rights. Many other questions about in the Muslim world today. Should we treat non-Muslims equally? Should they have equal rights with us? Should people be able to leave Islam and choose another religion as they leave their religion and choose Islam? Should we punish and go after people if they say something offensive about Islam? All these questions, blasphemy, apostasy, human rights, women's rights, I think can be solved through this reinterpretive lens. We should understand that justice is the goal of the Sharia. And that's a dynamic idea. It might be something different. It can be treating your slave well in 19th century. In the 9th century, it would be abolishing slavery in the 19th century. And I fear that if we don't make this switch, if we don't reinterpret certain things, if we insist blindly without understanding the divine intention behind religious texts, if we insist blindly preserving them, if we insist as if some people defended slavery until 1980s, some people still do. What will happen is that the rest of humanity will look into our religion and they will be horrified by it. That is already happening. And the answer to, of course, when I say this, I know what the answer will come. The answer will be, we don't care about what the kuffar says. Well, not really. We are proud that when Islam came to the world scene, one of the things it did was to stop female infanticide. Pagan Arabs were killing their newborn babies, female babies. And the Quran stopped that, condemned that. So we show this as the great moral progress that Islam brought to history, as it was. So that was a progress that is understandable by every human being. But now, are we going to look to the world and say, we have standards who are actually quite horrifying from your perspective, to your conscience, but we just do it because we're blindly doing this? I worry that this will deepen the crisis we have in certain parts of the world. I see a lot of people abandoning their faith in Islam because they see these bigoted interpretations of Islam. Ultimately, people will ask, why are you fearful of freedom? Are you not confident about your faith? Why are we afraid that if Christians say Allah, we will be confused, but not they will be confused? Why are we demanding equal rights for ourselves when we are citizens of non-Muslim societies, but why don't we give it to others when we are the majority? I think these questions should be discussed. And again, I'm not a mufti, I'm not a fatwa authority here, but I'm calling on those who have the authority to rethink these issues, because these are serious issues that we have to solve. And the problems here, I worry, are covering the beauties of our faith, which humanity needs, we should be able to share. But if all we share is rigidity, bigotry, and oppression, we are.
Mr. Mustafa, may I? You've got 2 more minutes. Could you please wind up? Thank you.
Actually, this is the end of it. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your learned presentation. There's a lot of food for thought here. Now, I will go on to the commentator number 1, Chirozana Muhammad Isa, for her learned comments on Mr. Mustafa's presentation. Thank you, Rosanna. It's yours. You've got 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Shad, and thank you very much, Mustafa, for that very enlightening presentation. And I have to say that much of it, the questions that you raised, the concerns that you have, the same as the concerns that I have, and I very much resonate with all that you have said so far. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you to all who have been listening and tuning in. And of course, thank you to G25 and EdUnity Foundation for inviting me from Sisters in Islam to share some commentaries on what has been presented. I think in the first point that I would like to raise is on the issue of authority, because this is the biggest issue that we come across and encounter in Malaysia, particularly because we do have religious authorities, we do have bureaucratization of religion. There's a department under the prime minister's office, which has got a tremendous amount of budget. There are and religion also is a state matter in Malaysia. So meaning that for each state, where Islamic laws are concerned, is actually under the purview of the states, aside from some of it under the federal as well. But having said that, we are also, under the purview, being under the purview of the state, meaning that, we have different laws in different states. They are mostly similar, but there are some differences. And ultimately, when you talk about, a unified law on Islamic family law, for instance, there isn't one. When you talk about Islamic family law, essentially, we are talking about 14 different kinds of Islamic family laws in Malaysia. We're talking about 14 different kinds of Sharia criminal offences acts enactments in Malaysia, different kinds of other, administrative enactments to implement and administer the religion of Islam in all the states in Malaysia. So, and we do also have, in all those states, there are the different fatwa committees, there are the different religious Islamic councils. So it's very much, there's a lot of, dealing with authorities, religious authorities, when it comes to the practice of Islam in Malaysia. And ultimately, as citizens, as normal citizens, as Muslims in Malaysia, we are very much, we have to be aware, because there are some of these practices, like you talked about, Mustafa, in relation to, the freedom, to what extent do we actually have the freedom to practice, our Islam in Malaysia. That is very much scrutinized. You talked about how, during the fasting month, over here in Malaysia, if you are fasting, or if you are not fasting, definitely there are authorities out there on patrol, ensuring, there's no Muslims, selling, opening up their stalls and serving to Muslims during the day. And if they are, even if they are, let's say, elderly people who are not able to fast for health reasons, or for health reasons, if they are eating in public, or they are eating, within close confines of a restaurant that's not supposed to be serving during that time, they will be policed, they will be caught, and they will be charged. So it's a very quite a tense, situation where, during Ramadan, you are looking forward to a time of peace. But at the same time, that, you will be expecting, in the news, there will be people, getting caught for not adhering, to the practice that is expected of them, and their choice to, or for whatever reason they choose to not fast, that is something that is secondary. Yeah, whatever it is, they should be seen, to be complying and adhering and practicing with the Ramadan practices. The second thing I would like to also talk about is, that's very tied into this issue of authority as well, is this whole issue of gender equality, because gender equality is something that, women's groups have been pushing for over 30 years. It started out with the work that women's groups have been doing to ensure that, women are being recognized as equals, to address this whole issue of, domestic violence. Domestic violence, is a practice that hurts women. And 30 years ago, women's rights group have been pushing on the ground to make sure that we have a domestic violence act. There's a worldwide global movement, for countries to push for domestic violence acts and protect women. And the reason given at that time was that Muslim women would not be covered under this act because under the Quran, husbands are allowed to beat their wives. And so this is where the work of Sisters in Islam actually comes in. You talked about, reinterpretation of the Quranic text. And so this is one of the efforts that Sisters in Islam made, along with, in consultation with scholars, to talk about, how, Islam doesn't condone wife beating, especially in today's day and age and during our time. And I have to say as well, when it comes to authority, the whole idea of authority within the family, who controls, who has the authority to make decisions, to have a say in the lives of everyone in the family. And of course, it's the father, because he is regarded as the head of the household. He's regarded the head of the family. And for young girls, young women, the first thing that's always drilled into them is that, when you get married, you have to be obedient to your husband. You have to acknowledge his authority. And if you are not compliant, if you are disobedient to him, then you are committing nushuz, and therefore he has the right to beat you up. So that's the first text that, women's groups have a lot of challenges dealing with because, of its explicitity. However, there are also so many other Quranic verses that talk about marriage being, a marriage of mawaddah wa rahmah, that there should be love and there should be care and there should be respect for one another. But somehow, it's verse 434 that really overarches the Muslim model marriage, and not just in Malaysia, it's globally as well. So this is definitely the work that, women's rights groups like Sisters in Islam and other women's rights groups in other Muslim contexts are also working, to look at the lived realities of today. Because when you were also talking about the text and also the context, and the context of today definitely has changed so much from 7th century Arabia. Women are the one out there becoming the breadwinners of the family, caring for the family, taking decisions for the family as well. However, in terms of jurisprudence, there isn't that shift to give recognition that, there is a certain level of leadership here or decision making that women are taking, and important decisions that are being taken, just as the men were doing so many years ago. A lot of cases that, we're encountering within our Telenisa services where husbands are not paying their maintenance to the children upon divorce. So there is a lot of reality that we have to deal with. And this whole issue of obedience and authority is something that we are still trying to grapple with. It is actually very hard to make women realize, even though they are the ones, we've engaged with single mothers. We tell them that, who's the one taking decisions in your family? We are, and so therefore you are the head of the family. You are the head of households, and they find it very difficult to reconcile that reality with, what has been informed to them over, many years, that, it's always the husband or the father who's the head of the family. And we also have to recognize the reality when it comes to the whole issue of looking at the text, reinterpreting the text in the context of, pushing gender equality in all our countries. 30 years ago, maybe, we only have maybe, like a handful of women scholars that, whom are writing on these issues, writing on feminism, writing on women's rights, and also writing from within the Islamic framework as well. But 30 years later, you've actually got, a lot more women, producing so much scholarship. They are at the center of the production of Islamic knowledge and especially in the West. Interestingly, it's all happening in the West, and that's something that I kind of like only realized this maybe a few months ago, because we have so many books that we're encountering. And every time I look at, where is this? Who is publishing this? And where is this scholar located? And most of the women scholars producing knowledge on Islam are located in the West, and you have to ask why, and is it because there is that room and space and freedom to think about the possibilities of reading the text, and re-examining previous texts, previous jurisprudence, and how do we move forward from those positions then to the positions today, and meets the realities of today. One thing, also in relation to the issue of authority, how all of us are very much encouraged to read the Quran in Arabic. That I can't say there's a lot of campaigns, consistent campaigns going on about reading the Quran, in Arabic, reading it properly with the tajwid and all, so there's a lot of efforts there. However, I think there is also, that equal demand for us to be able to read the Quran and understand the Quran, in our translation, local language, either English or Malay and so forth. Even though they will have all these different parentheses with all kinds of different added words in them. Because it is somehow we are not encouraged to take that authority for ourselves, to read the Quran in our language, to understand it in the way that the text, the translation has presented it to us, and for us to raise questions and have discussions on them. I remember Zaina Anwar, a founding member of Sisters in Islam, she was sharing with us how the CIS founding members have been, they've gathered for 3 years. They met every weekend, read the Quran for themselves in guidance with a teacher. And one of the things that she discovered in relation to the verse on polygamy was the verse Anisa 129, where it talked about, if you feel that you cannot do justice, marry only one, and that you will never be able to do justice, because even if it's your ardent desire. So in relation to the verse on polygamy, and Zaina was so excited about the discovery of this verse for 1 to 9. She's never encountered it before, and so she went to her office and she was excited to show it to her friends, to her colleagues at her workplace, and they were so reluctant to look at it. They were so reluctant, even though Zaina was saying, but this is the Quran. What I'm showing to you is the Quran. What I'm showing to you is this is what the verse has been translated, that, when it comes to the issue of polygamy, it very much supports the notion of monogamy, because men will never be able to do justice, even if that's what they want to do. And she relayed how the people around her were in fear of just listening to this. So it's quite interesting, how much our understanding of the Quran is very much limited to what our preacher, our ustaza tells us, but we don't go beyond, because we also don't take the authority for ourselves, to read and understand the Quran, and raise the questions and have the discussions. So I also want to share as well, because you also raised the issue about the text, and what's being amended in the text in terms of the translation. Again, on the issue of polygamy, because there was, we have a copy of Abdullah Yusuf Ali translation. I think it was in 1986. I think it was like in the 80s or the 90s, where actually in his commentary, he had put the commentary there where he said that, looking at the verses of the polygamy and considering, what certain verses are saying. And then he says that, in his opinion, I'm paraphrasing, that in his opinion, he thinks that Islam is more in support of monogamy than polygamy. And what is interesting is that I'm running out of time. I'll try to wrap up in 2 minutes.
5 more minutes. 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Prof. Shah. And subsequent publications of that translation by Abdullah Yusuf Ali has removed his opinion, his commentary about monogamy. So that's also something that's very interesting. What is being added in, as well as what is being taken out as well. I think I've covered. Okay, one more thing that I've got to talk about also is in relation to this whole question about what does freedom mean today, and all the questions that you raise, Mustafa, are so relevant because we're living in the 21st century. We are living in the context where human rights principles actually have a very important role to ensure that citizens in each country are being protected from governments that are despotic, regimes that are cruel to the people, and I would say that democracy. There's a close tie between freedom and democracy, and when we're talking about reform, we were also talking about you mentioned this just now. Democracy is at the heart of reform, and it's so critical that when we talk about reform, it's also important to know what's going on the ground. Engagement with the ground to understand the problems and realities is very important. And for the work that we do at Sisters in Islam, the voices and the realities and lived experiences of women on the ground is also very critical, because we're finding that where there is a disconnect between the laws and the lived realities, that's where injustice happens. And for us, our engagement with the text, with scholarship, with jurisprudence, is really to find a way where we can narrow this gap so that there will be less injustice for women out there. However, the reality of the context today with the governments today, government in Malaysia particularly, authorities are also actually very disconnected with what's going on the ground. We're looking at a reality where today, never mind, that gender equality is one issue, but then, we're also dealing with, environmental changes, the climate change. There's a crisis that's going on here. We're also dealing with COVID-19, the challenge of COVID-19 and how people are being affected. It's really important for us to see, if we're talking about, making laws and policies, and here's the crux of it. Here's the crux about, the freedom that we have, because in the context in Malaysia, I've not gone into the legal framework, but I think that may be covered later on when we maybe Dr. Chandra or maybe in the Q&A we will talk about the legal framework. But if that isn't that recognition that the recognition that in Malaysia laws and policies are made with reference to Islam. It is made, in reference to some of the sources in Islam, some scholarship in Islam, and this call, that Islam is a just religion. We want to see it happen, and for as long as it's not happening, then everyone in Malaysia, everyone has a right to speak about it. So, and raise questions, and if it challenges the notion of you're encroaching in my space and I should not be tolerant of this, I think that is something that we need to expand further, to say that as citizens we have our rights to talk about it. But the challenge that we have to do it is actually the spaces that we have or don't have, because we do have very laws that impinge on our rights to freedom of expression and speech, especially in the internet era as well. That is also happening. So this is where we do want to push for more tolerant views, and not just tolerant. I mean, we've been Malaysia for like 63, 64 years. And it's time we really learn how to accept one another than just merely tolerating. So I will end there. Thank you very much for giving me the
Thank you
space
so
and
much.
time.
Thank you. Just in time. It's very interesting, actually. Mr. Mustafa correctly pointed out that even in the earliest of times, there were possibilities of multiple interpretations, because if the text was read in context, there would be possibilities of richer views. And I like the way Rosanna has called on Muslims, especially Muslim women, to exercise their own reason, to go on a voyage of discovery, to discover the many potentialities um, within Islam. I just wanted to mention this to Rosanna. I agree with you that there is this problem of multiplicity of Islamic authorities and multiplicity of laws, 14 laws. At the same time, Rosanna, what this multiplicity of laws does is it proves to the Muslim population that there is possibility of more than one interpretation. So, for example, on apostasy, there are different interpretations in Negri Sembilan law, and let us say in the laws of our East Coast states. One mufti up north and the mufti somewhere else may have different opinions. And of course, the influence of adat. So, there is definitely tremendous potentiality for recognizing that Islam is a mansion with many rooms. There is possibility of diversity, and there always was, there always will be, because the Sharia is expressed in language. What is happening actually is the character of the interpreter gets superimposed on the religion, and interpreter is able to influence the way the law is to be interpreted. So we all need to discover new potentialities. Thank you very much. Now I call upon Dr. Chandra Muzaffar to give us his learned perspective. Thank you very much, Dr. Chandra.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Prof. Shad, Juan Rosana, Mr. Mustafa Akil, our guest speaker, friends who are listening in, and the general public. I'd like to begin by thanking G25 for this kind invitation. This is yet another contribution from G25 to the growth of ideas in the Malaysian society, but also within the larger Muslim world and the larger community of human beings. Let me kick off by making it very clear that I agree with Mustafa in principle and in substance. I agree that there is a need to rethink various fundamental issues in Islam. There is a need to re-emphasize freedom and reason. There is a need to respect differences of opinion, which we are told is a divine blessing. Ikhtilaf rahmat ilahi. It is a divine blessing. This goes to show that there are, as Mustafa has pointed out so well, sources that we could draw upon to develop a more universal, inclusive, and progressive approach to Islam that would be within the framework of the religion. Why are Muslims afraid of diversity of thought, of different points of view within the religion? I think this is something to do with the fear of being overwhelmed by others, of Islam losing its identity, of Muslims being forced into religions or into lifestyles which undermine the faith. This is a long history behind it, actually. One can argue, for instance, that the Mongol invasions of the Muslim world in the later part of the 12th and 13th centuries had created that sort of mentality within a very big segment of the Muslim world, this fear of different points of view becoming weak as a result of diversity of thought, others overwhelming you and taking over your society and so on, which in a sense it happened in the case of the Mongol invasions. We know how much damage they did to Islamic civilization. And I think this was reinforced by colonialism in its classic form for centuries, where almost all Muslim countries were colonized, with the exception of a few. And this feeling of insecurity became even stronger, largely because the colonial power not only took over the land, but took over the legal system, administration, politics, the economy, culture, and in many instances, religion itself. So Muslims became very fearful of their religion as a result of experiences of this sort. One could argue that it has continued in the neo-colonial era, which is the era that we are living in, because colonialism, at least some aspects of it, have expressed themselves in other forms. And that has also created this feeling of insecurity within a segment of Ummah. But apart from historical trends, happenings in history, the other reason why this has developed, and this in fact preceded the Mongol invasions, it is actually the rise of authoritarianism in the Muslim world, and that came before the Mongol invasions. Let's not forget that with Muawiyah, the fifth caliph in a sense, there was already the rise of authoritarianism, a change in political structures, and eventually the political culture. And the rise of authoritarianism has been a phenomenon that has confronted the Muslim world right through the centuries. Rulers, those connected with the rulers, wanting to monopolize power, interpret laws in a particular manner to basically suit their interests, vested interests that grew and developed as a result of this. And this has been a major factor. They don't want differences of opinion, these vested interests. They don't want debate, they don't want discussion. They believe in control and dominance. It has taken different forms at different times in different parts of the Muslim world. So that is a major challenge. I would say that in some instances it is even greater than the challenge posed by invasion from outside, the rise of authoritarianism from within Muslim societies, supported by religious scholars. Right from the time of Muawiyah onwards, you find the religious scholars have played their role of supporting authoritarian power. Now let us reflect a little on whether it's true that because of divisions and dichotomies within the Muslim world, differences of opinion, different theological positions, different positions on politics, the economy, culture, society, Muslim society has been weakened. This is the reason why we've become so susceptible to dominance from outside because of differences of opinion within the Muslim world. Now, if you examine our history very carefully, you'll find that this is not true. And more Muslim scholars should stand up and say this is not true. There were times when there were a great deal of differences within the Muslim world, especially differences pertaining to texts, to Muslim society and how it should be governed and so on. But in spite of these differences, Islamic civilization flourished. There were differences, but Islamic science, the arts flourished. Islam expanded in spite of these differences within the famous dynasties of Islam. What does this show? That it is not these differences of opinion which is the real problem. If Islamic civilization lost out at various points in history, it's not because of differences of opinion. It is because of elite corruption and abuse of power, as this happened right through history. This is the major cause of the fall of Muslim empires, of Muslim civilization. It's corruption, especially elite corruption, and abuse of power. Like every other civilization, we are no different from other civilizations in this respect, that it is corruption and abuse of power which have caused our downfall, not multiplicity of views, not diversity of thought, not debates, discussions. These were never the causes of the decline of Islamic civilization. On the contrary, one can argue that it's because of the flourishing of diversity of thought that Islamic civilization flourished. If you look at what had actually happened, if you look at the way in which diversity of thought on various issues had led to a huge corpus of literature where these issues were discussed and debated. You had someone like Al-Farabi, people like Ibn Sina, you had people like Ibn Arabi, you had all sorts of thinkers with such diverse positions. And they managed to produce great works. Of course, there were people who were unhappy with them at certain points, but there were also a lot of people who supported them, including rulers. So the point we have to remember is, the upshot of it all, that it is not diversity that leads to our decline and downfall, in the past as in the present. It is abuse of power, it's corruption. Now, having said that, let me also argue here that for us Muslims, the exploration of ideas, it's absorbing ideas from outside, the diversity of thought which I espoused just now, we can carry out all these activities with great confidence because there is an ultimate parameter that we know, that every Muslim knows we cannot transcend. We cannot transcend because it undermines the very basis of human existence. and that is the oneness of God, Tawhid, the idea of Tawhid. That is what provides that sort of perimeter, the fulcrum and the perimeter at the same time. Explore all our ideas, but we know that in very simplistic terms, that we cannot have a diversity of deities, for instance, as our faith, as a way of practicing our faith. Others can. That's their right. We also respect that. And that's also part of our religion. But within Islam, it's very clear. There is a fulcrum, there is a parameter. But here again, you see the way in which vested interests have misinterpreted this. We are so concerned about the anchor that is Tawhid. How is it that we encourage communal thinking? In other words, you encourage people to be totally blindly loyal to their tribe, to their community, to their caste. That is already against Tawhid. How is it you encourage this? How is it that you encourage racism, which is proclaiming the supremacy of race over everything else, which is what had happened in most other civilizations, but also within the Muslim world at certain periods in history. So the point one is making is that let us be consistent about this. If it is Tawhid, which is our basis, then I think we should take a very strong position against communalism, chauvinism, against sectarianism, tribalism, casteism, racism. We should be very clear about this, that this is not acceptable. Now, if we develop that sort of thinking, then I think we don't have to worry about diversity of thought, debate, discussion in the Muslim world. I know that there are certain things, you're looking at contemporary human rights issues, which have raised hackles within the Muslim world. Muslims are concerned about these issues. But again, you can go back to Tawhid, to the philosophy of Tawhid, and that provides a certain basis. For instance, does our freedom mean the freedom to embrace same-sex marriage? The Muslim world as a whole has been against it for good reasons, because it is clearly against Tawhid as understood by Muslims for most periods of history. Same-sex marriage is seen as something that undermines the family, undermines the male-female relationship, undermines, ultimately, creation itself. But that doesn't mean that one should ill-treat people who are sexually different, who are orientated differently. In fact, showing humanity towards them is essential to our faith, those who are different. And this is where I think many of our theologians have failed us. They've not been able to make that distinction, where they can point out very clearly using arguments harnessed from the texts, from Muslim history, that there's this profound literature about sexually oriented individuals, people who are different, and their rights and so on, and the need for humanity. And it's that humanity that we should exhibit. While at the same time, when it comes to something like same-sex marriage, one has a clear position. It's very interesting that the European Court of Human Rights, 27 jurists a few years ago, had come up with a very, very profound, comprehensive position on this. And they had rejected same-sex marriage as a fundamental human right. In other words, what I'm saying is that we don't just have to follow other people blindly. Because it's fashionable somewhere, we shouldn't just follow. We should think, we should reflect, we should be clear of our own principles, we should understand what the fundamentals are within our own tradition. I like the phrase from the great South American theologian, Gustavo Guterres, drink from our own wells. I think that's very, very important. We have to harness the strengths within our own society. And that's what I think, from what I've read of Mustafa, that's what he has been trying to do and what others have been trying to do. And that is a tradition that has a long history behind it, and we should continue that tradition. And today, more than ever before, we have to reassert human dignity and social justice. We have to draw upon those strengths within our own tradition and show that we are not supporters of bigotry, we are not supporters of xenophobia. We don't support the type of things that we have seen in the Muslim world, despotism, autocracies, and all the rest of it.
Dr.
We stand,
Chandra,
yes, I'm about to finish the last couple of sentences. How many minutes do I have?
take 2 more minutes, Dr. Chandra. 2 more minutes.
Yes, I'm at the end already, so thanks for the reminder. I think we should, at this point in time, more than at any other time in history, come out clearly and say that this is what we stand for. We cannot claim to speak for the whole of the Muslim world, but we can say that this is undoubtedly a position that is fundamental to Islam, but also fundamental to humanity. And in fact, we have to go beyond seeing these as Islamic positions. I've always been more inclined to argue that these positions are universal. They belong to the whole of humanity. And we have to say that this is the universal message that the human family needs at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chandra, for pointing out that diversity is a divine gift within parameters, of course. However, diversity of thought need not deny unity on core issues, and diversity of Islamic thought does not require us to blindly ape some of the modern trends. Thank you very much. Now, actually, we have come to the question and answer session. Initially, there will be 4 questions that have been submitted to us from our organizers. And may I just remind all our listeners that if you wish to ask questions, please use Slido. Go to slido.com, enter the event code #G25 and submit your questions. May I now read question number 1? And I will then invite the guest speaker and the commentators to comment on it. Question number 1 comes from G25 Malaysia member Tan Sri Muhammad Sharif bin Muhammad Qasim. He says that you would like to know what's our comment about religious authorities issuing fatwas and giving them the force of law, to criminalize personal sins with punishments like whipping and jail terms. He understands that UAE also has such laws. Is it a common practice in Muslim majority countries to criminalize personal sins into law? He has also expressed G25's concern with the new trend because it will lead to Malaysia having a dual system of criminal justice and thus undermining the secular character of Malaysian democracy. And he specifically asked me to comment on this. So I'll take up that invitation. But I will leave the issue of the status of fatwas and whether in Islam there is a distinction between sins and crimes. I'll leave that to the experts in Islamic law. I'll just give you the constitutional law perspective on this issue. First of all, Tansri, the fatwas are not by themselves law in Malaysian constitutional law. Article 160, Clause 2 of the Constitution defines law to include written law, common law, and custom to the extent recognized. Religious laws, rules of ethics and morality are not per se by themselves law unless they are incorporated into one of the three sources of law. Secondly, fatwas must be issued under a state enactments authority. It's not an independent power. The power must be conferred by a state enactment. Then the fatwa must be gazetted. Then the fatwa must have territorial restriction. A fatwa in Johor cannot apply in Selangor and vice versa. But I have to point out to you, in actual practice, sadly, what is happening is this, that sometimes civil servants, in their overzealousness, will apply a fatwa of federal territory into a matter actually which may be applicable only in Johor. Also, fatwas must not violate the federal constitution because Article 4, Clause 1 clearly says this constitution is the supreme law of the federation. Here again, I have to point out to you with some regret that when it comes to our civil courts, they tend to ignore the provisions of the chapter on fundamental rights. So many of the fatwas, many of the state enactments are regarded as if they are independent of the constitution. The good example would be Fathul Bari's case. Fathul Bari was prosecuted for speaking about Islam without a tauliya. He said, what about my freedom of speech? Under Article 10, freedom of speech is allowed unless I violate public order, national security, incitement, and offense. And that issue was disregarded, and the court said, no, too many views will confuse the Muslims, and therefore this Negri Seminar law is valid. Also, may I point out about fatwas, Tansri, that the punishment for violation of Islamic law is regulated, of course, by the Sharia Courts Criminal Jurisdiction Act, where 3 years jail, 5,000 ringgit fine, 6 strokes of the rotan. And may I point out to you something which may not be so well known. The powers of the Sharia courts in criminal matters are equivalent to the powers of second-class magistrates. So obviously the intention of the constitution makers in 1957 was that Sharia offenses will be basically minor offenses. Now, one very important issue I wanted to raise, especially to Rosina, you may like to take it up later on and I'll be happy to assist you. What type of offenses can be punished by Sharia law? Schedule 9, List 2, Item 1 says the states may create and punish offenses against the precepts of Islam. Sadly, the Constitution doesn't define what are precepts, and our civil courts, superior courts, have defined precepts so broadly as to include aqidah, akhlaq, and adab. Now, Sharia courts also should have jurisdiction in respect only of any of the matters included in this paragraph, but shall not have jurisdiction in respect of offenses except insofar as conferred by federal law. In Schedule 9, that's what it says. Sharia courts shall not have jurisdiction in respect of offenses except insofar as conferred by federal law. Now, Rosina, the federal legislation has abdicated its role here. Actually, the intention of the Constitution was the offenses to be punished by the Sharia court shall be prescribed. They have not done so. That's why actually the state enactments and Sharia courts are punishing more and more offenses. The law is very clear in Schedule 9. The Sharia court shall not have jurisdiction in respect of offenses except insofar as conferred by federal law. So, Tansri, that's my constitutional view. Now, I'll go to the Mr. Mustafa. Would you enlighten us on the status of fatwas in Islamic theory? And does Islam make a distinction between personal sins and public crimes? Thank you, sir.
Of course, I don't know the Malaysian legal system nearly as that you know, so I'm not going to comment on that. What I can say is that, I mean, first the question was whether in Muslim majority societies is there this imposition, is there this religious policing? In some of them, yes. I mean, UAE is one of them, Saudi Arabia for sure, Iran. About a dozen, I think, Muslim majority societies, you can say that there are forces that really, police forces that really monitor whether people eat in Ramadan or whether they are, you know, pious. I mean, alcohol, if they are drinking alcohol and whatever. And not all the Muslim world. I mean, there are more than 50 Muslim majority countries, of course, in the world. So this happens in some of them. Now, I'll say two things on top of this. First of all, does this really make these societies more pious, more righteous? And when Muslims are not policed, are they becoming less pious? The answer is no in both cases. Turkey, my country, in Turkey, we don't have Islamic law since the beginning of the Republic. Even in late Ottoman Empire, there was a lot of secularization of the legal system. So in Turkey, nobody monitors whether you are fasting in Ramadan or not. But majority of Turks fast because you fast not for the police, but for God. Your responsibility is to God. Or Turkish police doesn't chase women to cover their hijab. Like maybe half of Turkish women do wear hijab, and others don't. And that is, I mean, Turkey has other political problems that I don't want to get into here. But Turkey is, for example, a country where Islam isn't enforced by the state, and it should remain like that. There's some questions markers about that. And this didn't stop Turkish society being very pious. And I have some colleagues who lived in Iran and Tehran, and some of them said this is, of course, an observation, not data, but Iranian society can be less observant than Turkish society, although Islam is an Islamic republic, but people are fed up with that Islamic republic. A lot of people are. I mean, there are, of course, people who identify with the regime. There are also people genuinely pious. But a lot of people in Iran, especially in big cities, have actually become not practicing people, and they drink at home, but in public they don't. Of course, they don't show it. So this kind of enforcement of piety only leads to hypocrisy. This should end, if you ask me, anywhere in the Muslim world. I know it's not going to happen soon, but that's what the ideal should be. Now, regarding fiqh and jurisprudence. Now, I have a whole chapter in the book on this issue, hispa, on religious policing. Now, I will admit that in Sunni jurisprudence, yes, it was considered that if you publicly commit a sin, which could be drinking wine or not abiding by the dress code, some people considered music haram, so those would be punished by authorities, like flogging and other punishments. And this was extracted from a few sources, but one is the Quranic commandment of commending the right and forbidding the wrong, Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar. But this is an interpretation. We know that in early centuries, this idea of commending the right and forbidding the wrong, Quranic injunction, wasn't understood exactly as religious policing. It was understood as proclaiming Islam and preaching the faith, and combating polytheism. So this idea evolved in Sunni jurisprudence over time, as I actually argue in my book, and I demonstrate, I think, in my book. And again, that was the way society worked. I mean, Christians were doing the same thing and Muslims were doing the same thing. It's just how the principles of Islam was understood and implemented. I think we should look at this like slavery, that, you know, it was a part of the Sharia, but it's not meant to be. And today we should look at the consequences of this. So I hear about police forces in Malaysia. Ramadan is coming now in 2 days, and Ramadan Mubarak, by the way, for everybody who's hearing us. I mean, I see police forces checking if you eat a sandwich or not. What is the logic of that? I mean, we're not fasting for the government, for the authorities. Fast is for God, so it should be between us and God. And the idea of monitoring this is just absurd. And I think we should give up this in Malaysia or Pakistan. And I know Pakistan has a lot of laws about that as well, and certainly a lot of countries in the Gulf.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a second learned comment from Dr. Narima Awin, and it's addressed to Mr. Mustafa Akil. Basically, it's a comment and question about the role of reason by ijtihad, and she has mentioned how actually notable Muslim scholars like Muhammad Abdu Rashid Rida in Egypt, Sayyid Ahmad Khan in India had enriched thinking with their reasoning. She has two questions based on your observation. How much is ijtihad exercised in other countries, and to what extent are these ijtihads based on reasons that reflect current realities? And she is relating this to a specific unfortunate event, and that is this: when Turkey recently reconverted the Hagia Sophia Museum back to a mosque. She contrasts this with our second Caliph Omar al-Khattab, who declined to offer to perform his prayer in the church, so that Muslims will not use that as an excuse to convert other people's place of worship. So she's wondering whether the Hagia Sophia debacle is something that experts outside of Turkey should have commented on and taken a stand on. Is there a case for ijtihad on an international level, possibly under the auspices of the OIC?
Well, I don't know whether the OIC will say or should say anything on this, but Hagia Sophia reconversion was, of course, an important issue last summer. I myself wrote an article about that in the New York Times. The title was, "Would Prophet Muhammad Convert Hagia Sophia?" And what I argued was this: Islam began as an extraordinary tolerant religion for the world at the time, because Islam did something that Christianity at the time did not do, which was to accept Christians and Jews as legitimate religious traditions. Not with full rights, but still remarkable rights for that age. And we know that the churches and synagogues are mentioned only once in the Quran, and with respect. And we know that Prophet Muhammad did not convert any church. He actually has certain agreements, covenants with some Christians of his time in the Arabian Peninsula, and he protected their churches. He gave them protection. Later, when Islam went out of the Arabian Peninsula with the conquests of Caliph Umar, when Muslims took Jerusalem, we know they did not convert the churches in Jerusalem. That is why there are churches in Jerusalem that are as old as this. I mean, thousands of, I can say older than Islam, which is older than 14 centuries. And the Church of Holy Sepulchre, as you said, is one of those, very important for Christianity. So it is not that Islam came to the world scene converting everything. Well, Islam converted Kaaba, people generally say that, but Kaaba had a special status because Muslims believed, and it's in our faith, that Abraham had built Kaaba as a monotheistic temple originally. So the conversion of Kaaba from paganism into monotheistic shrine was like restoring to its original principle. It was the idea. And also there was a war situation, of course, with the pagans. Other than that, Islam didn't touch the churches. Now, at some point, jurists introduced the idea that if you take a city with war, instead of that city surrendering to you, you can convert their biggest temples, that is churches or synagogues, mostly churches. Now, as I argued in my piece, this didn't have any basis in the Quran or Sunnah, because there is no example of Prophet converting a church or the Quran speaking about this. There's no scriptural basis. This was, as I understand, and I refer to the relevant scholars who wrote on this was imperial policy. It was the politics of that time. The Ottomans did this often. They conquered Istanbul with arms in 1953. And they still tolerated some church, which was an important thing at the time, but they converted Hagia Sophia. So I see the Ottoman conversion of Hagia Sophia in 1953 as not an Islamically mandated or justified policy. It was just a secular maslaha of the time. I mean, they thought in imperial terms, and Byzantines were doing the same thing. Probably they would do more. And the Catholics in Spain also converted, of course, the great mosque of Cordoba, which became a cathedral. So it was an imperial world, and that was the norms of the world. Now, my argument about Hagia Sophia, when Turkey recently reconverted back into a mosque, was that, listen, what happened in history happened, but let's just preserve the building with its history. And I've been writing about this in Turkey since the early 2000s. I've argued that if you're going to reopen Hagia Sophia, let's open it as a mosque, but let's give Christians a part of it so they can, we can share the building, which would be a great example of the pluralism, that is inherent in the Islamic tradition. Of course, the Turkish government didn't go with that. I mean, they did what they did, but that's my view on Hagia Sophia.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. There is another question, again addressed to Mr. Mustafa. This is from our highly respected, retired judge, member of the Human Rights Commission, Dato Sri Hishamuddin Yunus. Basically, it's a question about apostasy. And he would like to know what's the common view among Muslim jurists on the punishment of apostasy, whether it should be death. Actually, you had covered this issue earlier, but maybe you just sum it up again. There are two questions here. One is whether punishment for apostasy, the punishment of death, whether this is the correct interpretation of Islamic law. And secondly, a related question is, should the state punish a Muslim person who renounces Islam and opt for another religion? Or should this be solely a matter between that person and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Thank you for the question from the respected judge. And let me begin with the end of the question. Yes, it should be between the person and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It should be between the person, the individual, and God. And because the individual is responsible to God, not to us in terms of his beliefs. Now, how was apostasy seen in classical Islam? Well, in classical jurisprudence, the four Sunni schools and the Shia school, Jafari, the main Shia school, Jafari, they all considered apostasy as a capital crime, punishable by death. So there was almost consensus about this. However, Hanafis made a little, and also I think the same thing is in the Jafari school too. Hanafis made a little distinction. They said apostates should be punished with death only if they are males. Females would be given a lesser punishment. Now, to me, this is a sign that why they were more tolerant to females, because females are not soldiers in medieval settings. To us, this shows that they were considering that the apostate, by definition, is somebody who leaves the Muslims and joins the enemy who's at war with you. So he becomes combat, in a combat situation, it's like deserting to the other side. Women didn't have the combat capability at the time in medieval times, so they were considered as less of an issue, which again shows us the context of this issue. Now, in the modern era, what has happened? I should say that the Ottoman Empire faced this issue in mid-19th century because in the Tanzimat era, the Ottoman Empire began to adopt certain institutions, liberal institutions from the West, and laws. And the issue of apostasy was an important issue, and it was raised actually by the European powers, and there were a few executions in Istanbul. And ultimately, the Ottoman Empire found the solution in just bypassing fiqh and establishing a state policy that apostates will not be touched. So it was like siyasa solving the issue without necessarily doing something in fiqh. But it became possible in late Ottoman Empire to really become an apostate. I mean, and there are some even atheists, people who would be normally targeted as an apostate, or materialist. Let's say more clearly. Regarding the Islamic jurisprudence in the Sunni world today, there are a few views. One is the classical harsh view that apostates, murtad, should be killed, period. So that view is upheld by the more rigid, let's say, scholars in the Sunni world, I can say, Salafis and some more rigid traditionalists.
Mustafa, can I move on to the next question?
Sorry.
I'm running out of time.
Okay. There is a relatively milder position which says, well, apostate will be executed or punished if he deserts Islam, but then also attacks Islam. Okay, but what is attacking Islam? Is it bombing mosques? Okay, that's a crime and people should be, of course, punished for that. But if it is just speaking out and criticizing, I don't agree with that too, because that should not be considered as a crime. So I think we should accept freedom of conscience, and we don't need to do that to preserve our faith. People believe in Islam because they believe Islam is true, not because we are threatening them.
Thank you. Last question from G25 is from Dato Zainuddin Bahari, addressed to the panel. I'll request Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. The question is about interfaith dialogue and how actually it arouses some suspicion amongst Muslims on the ground that interfaith dialogue would mean that the Malay Muslim population may be misled. Also, interfaith dialogue involves the belief that everyone must be treated equally. So, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, what's your view about the need or the dangers of interfaith dialogue in this country of ours?
Sure. Is there a question to me?
Yeah, for a multi-religious society like ours, we've had a long history of interfaith dialogue. Actually, it started before Rebecca, before independence. And the ones who initiated interfaith dialogue, you may be surprised to know, at that time were actually the Muslims. And right through, you find that Muslims have played a role in interfaith dialogues in this country. But if it is understood as knowing each other's faith, explaining certain essentials, the different faiths, I don't think it raises problems. The question becomes quite serious, the question of interfaith dialogue, when issues like, whether one's religion is right and other religions are wrong, what is the true religion, and issues connected with religious figures and religious episodes. These things that are controversial come to the fore. And generally people avoid this. And I think if you're trying to build a better understanding of different faiths, there are, to my mind, three approaches, interrelated approaches. First is, one is to know the other faith, at least essentials, that I think is good, continue dialoguing for the purpose. Number two, I think it is very, very important to do community service on an interfaith basis. That really helps to strengthen bonds, strengthen relations. Don't go into the controversies. Do community work, social work, helping the poor, helping drug addicts, helping people with the HIV positive, things of that sort. I think this is where a great deal of interfaith work can be directed. And of course, the street children and, the homeless and all the rest of it. And it has worked in various societies, including Malaysia, where that sort of bonding has helped. And the third, I think, is trying to have interfaith dialogue. I think you have to look at certain issues which trouble various communities and therefore impede dialogue. There are always issues of that sort. Muslims, for instance, may be troubled by certain things which non-Muslims do, and non-Muslims also would be troubled by things that Muslims do. So those things, I think, you can dialogue after you've built the relations between number one and number two. Some sort of understanding, bonding, then I think we can address it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, we're now going to have some more questions, some questions from the public. We're running out of time, so we have to have short and crisp answers. Perhaps Rosanna could take this question. Anonymous, is there a political will to be more tolerant? Maybe you could say no or yes.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's probably half and half. I think with certain political parties, there are strains of wanting to have more tolerance, but it always comes at a cost of what does this tolerance look like? What does it mean? How does it manifest itself? And I think the bread and butter issues, always comes as proof of, the tolerance or intolerance. So that's all I have to say at the moment.
There's a next question I want to pose to Mr. Mustafa. It says, if the Quran is interpreted contextually, then will that not mean that most of its laws will not be relevant today?
But sometimes not literally, because we should understand that the Quran speaks to a society and improves the condition of that society. And I think one historic mistake, is to detach Quran from this historic context to which it was revealed. If we don't understand that, if we say every verse of the Quran is literally applicable everywhere, we will really run into absurd results. Kill the polytheists wherever you find them. That's a verse in the Quran, Surah Al-Tawbah 5. Well, this verse it doesn't mean that Muslims should look around, polytheists to attack them. This verse was a commandment given to Prophet Muhammad in a very specific historical situation where the Muslims had made a treaty with the polytheists, and the polytheists has broken the treaty. They had attacked the Muslims many times. So ultimately, this was a commandment given in a battle situation. Or the Quran tells Muslims to raise war horses as a protection, to strengthen their military power. Nobody raises war horses today. We understand that it might be a metaphor for military power. We understand as tanks or warplanes and so on and so forth. So the Quran is speaking to a society. The intention of the Quran is universal. And if we don't understand that, we run into these problems of trying to realize the wording of the Quran, but betraying the intention. I think the right perspective on this issue was offered by the late Fazlur Rahman, the great scholar of renewal in Islam, who passed in 1998. He was originally from Pakistan, but he later lived in the United States. his idea was that we should go back to the Quran, the two movement theory. We should go back to the Quran, understand what the Quran is trying to do in that historical context, and bring the intention to today. I'll give you one example. This is probably one of the most interesting issues and burning issues. Corporal punishments. The Quran says, amputate the hands of the thieves. Now, if you understand this literally, we have to implement this today literally. But if you look into that society, you see two important things. There were no prisons in 7th century Arabia, and pre-Islamic Arabs were also amputating the hands of the thieves. It was the only way to punish a crime in those social conditions. So something that the pre-Islamic Arabs were doing, the Quran continued that because theft has to be stopped in any society. Today, the lesson from there today is to prevent theft, protect private property, which is necessary in every society, but we can use other methods to do that. As the Ottomans and other Islamic states, let's say, in history already did. I mean, the Ottoman Empire changed a lot of the corporal punishments into prison sentences, and this was not seen as a deviation from Islam.
Sorry. There's another question here about Muslims marrying non-Muslims. Why can a Muslim from most other countries, except some third world countries, marry their loved ones without making them convert to Islam? And why not Malaysia? Basically, in Malaysia, if a Muslim girl cannot marry a non-Muslim, he has to convert. A Muslim man can marry a non-Muslim girl if she converts. So in many other countries, the law allows civil marriages. So why is this so in Malaysia? Maybe that's a question that either Rosanna or Dr. Chandra could answer. We won't ask Mustafa to answer that question. Rosanna, you want to say something?
Yes, this is also a question that's actually been coming up in more recent times, and it's addressed to sisters in Islam. Yes, we do have, jurisprudence that restricts, marrying of Muslim women to non-Muslim men, but Muslim men are allowed to marry people of the book. And that's the most popular jurisprudence that we know and we've been taught of. But in Malaysia, there is that restriction of if you want to marry a Muslim, regardless whether it's a man or woman, then the other party will have to convert. And this has been challenged quite a lot because I think in reality, there's just so much of intermingling going on between people of diverse religions. And it's also interesting to look at the examples of women, Muslim women in the West, where there are marriages that have taken place where women remain, within their Muslim faith and their spouse remain within their other faith. I think at the end of the day, it's also about control. I mean, even though Muslim men are allowed to marry of people of the book, but you still don't find that as a practice here anyway. So where I want to say gender is an issue, having said that, even with the provision that it is allowed for men, it's not taking place. I think really our laws, that is something that we really need to perhaps, this whole issue of tolerance is the whole question, isn't it? How do you tolerate, how do you accept somebody of another faith, marrying into the family and they remain within their religion? It's a soul searching for us. We're so guarded about our religion. We don't want it to be, we don't know it. I think it's all about control. We don't know how to deal with it. And when we don't know how to deal with things, then we just, put a ban or a stop to it, and that this is the criteria. So.
And two other questions. Perhaps one of them, I'll combine the two, not one. I'll combine the two. First of all, child marriage in Islam. And secondly, what's the current Sunni Islam jurisprudence on the LGBT community? Can I leave it open to any of you who would like to answer child marriage as well as jurisprudence on LGBT?
Maybe I'll talk about child marriage for a bit. So there's been a lot of work being done over the past few years by women's groups, by NGOs to push to raise the minimum age of marriage to 18 for both Muslim and non-Muslim women, and that because right now there is a flaw for non-Muslim women, but there isn't one for Muslim girls. There isn't a flaw, and so all these cases of children being married off age 9 and 11, it's happening. It's still going on, and in fact, during the COVID period, there have been a lot of challenges, not only just in Malaysia but also in Indonesia as well. The romanticization of child marriages, where it's frowned upon for couples who are not married to be spending time together, and so parents have been opting to marry their children off at the same time, continuing their education. So, we're coming up with another different kind of situation where previously perhaps education may not be continued for those who are married off early, who are in child marriages. But there certainly is a trend that's and we hope it's not. We don't know the numbers yet. We want to know the numbers for certain, but it's a concern. It definitely is a concern, because even in Indonesia they have changed the laws. They have increased the age of marriage to 19. In fact, for girls and for men and women. And yet, culturally, with the pandemic, because of the challenges in relation to poverty and in relation to close proximity, it's very hard to encourage. But I think there's a lot of work that's being done by Indonesia. But for Malaysia, I think it's encouraging that we have one state that has increased the age of marriage. There are other states that have indicated that they want to follow suit. However, there are also other states that indicate child marriage is still necessary in their state. And that is what is worrying, because for as long as child marriages take place, that child, that young mother, that woman, will remain very, very vulnerable to all kinds of sexual reproductive health and rights issues, domestic violence, and poverty.
I'm just wondering, Rosanna, whether Article 11, Clause 5 could come to the assistance in this matter. Article 11, Clause 5 says that freedom of religion is subject to public order, public health, and morality. Could the issue of child marriage be subsumed under the concept of morality, and thereby actually it would permit legislation on
I
this
think
point?
that is something to definitely look into. Thank you so much for that, Prof. Shah.
Right. Now, LGBT, is gonna.
What's the question again on LGBT?
No. What is the Islamic jurisprudence, Sunni Islamic jurisprudence in relation to the LGBT? Perhaps this is something that Mr. Mustafa or Dr. Chandan Muzaffar may like to handle. Just a few words.
Sure, I can say. First of all, I would like to add that child marriage is unacceptable, and some people say, "Oh, Prophet Muhammad in his time, there were marriages with younger people." Well, it was again a different society. People didn't go to school at the time. People lived shorter. In all pre-modern societies, puberty was seen as the marriage age. So again, this is like saying that Prophet Muhammad lived in a certain culture. We should live in the exact same homes. It's different. It was his culture. It was that society. We live in a different society. Modern research shows that people mature at age 18 on average. The girls need to go to school, need to get education, so child marriage should not be allowed. Now, on LGBT and similar issues, here is one distinction I would like to make. Whether Islam morally approves a certain behavior is one thing. Whether the people who have that behavior or that belief are equal citizens with rights is another thing. I don't think the Sunni jurisprudence on LGBT isn't very liberal. I mean, I can say they're pretty harsh statements. Again, Hanafis are a little different on that. The Hanafi law is, as in most issues, because they said there's nothing directly in the Quran, actually. Whether it counted as zina or not, they were not sure about that. At least it was a gray area. But generally, it's harsh. But we should understand that, again, Islam can have moral judgments, right? I can think that gambling is a Islamically wrong thing, but my neighbor might be gambling and he might be my neighbor and he's an equal citizen with rights. Islam can say this kind of sexual relationship is not right from our moral perspective, but people have that and they are equal citizens. They are taxpayers. Malaysia is a state with citizens with different beliefs and lifestyles, right? In Turkey, my country, a lot of people are pious Muslims. There are LGBT Turks. They're Muslims too, by the way. I mean, most of them are actually believing. And we should understand that LGBT individuals have a difficult life. I mean, they come with an inborn inclination, which is not the mainstream, more common approach, which makes their life difficult. And they are harassed and they are looked down upon and they have a difficult life. I think the compassion of Islam, the respect of Islam should come to the fore. I'm not saying that Islam should say every form of sexual behavior is morally right. Islam doesn't allow premarital relationship between unmarried people or zina as well. But whether you see this as a crime punishable by the state is a different issue. And I think people, regardless of what their lifestyles, beliefs are, should be treated equally as citizens with their human rights.
Is there a right to privacy in Islam?
Exactly, that's true.
Right. Okay. Now we have run out of time, in fact. But there is one final question from Tansri Hashmi Agam, and maybe I could address that to Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. Tansri says, "Is the issue we are discussing in this webinar a matter of concern to the OIC? If not, for whatever reasons, and it refuses to do so, should not concerned Muslims create an alternative international Islamic forum to discuss these issues of importance for a better understanding and acceptance of Islam by the international community as a religion of divine mercy?" So do we need an alternative forum to bring out some of these issues that are challenging the Muslim community?
I would say yes, but we should not focus on governments getting together. Governments have their own political interests and political fights and tensions, and Saudis and Iranians will be, very bitter on whatever happening on the two sides of the Persian Gulf. And what we need more is, I think, more interaction between Muslim intellectuals and NGOs. But that requires a culture where when I say something and you say something, the other person will not say, "You murtad, you kafir, you heretic." I mean, so we need also a culture of having different Muslims in one tent, being able to discuss, being able to agree to disagree. And that should include Sunni authorities, Shia Muslims. I know Shia Muslims are not very fully tolerated in Malaysia, unfortunately. Whomever calls itself a Muslim and prays towards Qibla. There's a beautiful term, Ahl al-Qibla, in our tradition. People who pray towards Mecca. We should all accept them as fellow Muslims, no matter what they think. And yes, we need more of those platforms. But I would not see this as a governmental endeavor.
Dr. Chandra, would you say something?
I would like to see it from another, angle, Prof. I think the fundamental issue facing not just Islam but other religions today is religions are deeply intertwined with identity. And in some societies, identity becomes a much more serious issue than in other societies for various reasons. Malaysia is an example where the whole question of identity is supreme. Now, my point is religion about identity? Shouldn't we argue that if you look at the essence of faith, it is not about identity. The essence of faith is about the human being and values, how we live, our character. That is the essence of faith. Now, as long as religions do not link with the essence of faith, which is values and the importance of character, and as long as they are enamored with the question of identity, I think it's going to be a problem. OIC, in a sense, is related to identity, Muslim identity. We have to go beyond that. We have to go beyond that and have to look at issues of values, of character, of principles. Only then can we overcome this challenge that faces us. And which is why I've never ever been too interested in movements that are tied to a particular religion or a particular identity. We have to deal with it. But if you reduce religion to identity, this is the challenge you face. We have to overcome that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have run out of time. So that's one thing. Secondly, let's not forget that Mr. Mustafa, it's now 11:07 at night.
Yes.
I don't think we should keep him up too late. So I'll take this opportunity now to end the question and answer session. I apologize to all our participants whose questions could not be answered. Perhaps organizers could send these questions to the panelists, and maybe the panelists may want to answer later on. Now, thank you to everyone for tuning in. Thank you very much to Mustafa for his learned presentation, to the commentators.
Thank you very much.
For your intellectual edification. We look forward to more such sessions because, of course, these are all journeys, intellectual journeys, and not destinations. Thank you very much, then. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Good night, Mr. Mustafa, and have a good day. Please take care, all of you. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Mubarak. It's coming today. Yes.
Oh, yes, Ramadan Mubarak for tomorrow.
Very pleased to be on the same panel with you. Thank you very much. And salam.
Alaikum salam.